Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to our 5G national security event here at Venable. We're so proud to be doing this event with the Potomac Institute. Over the last several years, we've really built up a great partnership with the Potomac Institute, and we're really pleased that we can use this great space to bring these events to people's attention and get more involvement, more interest from all of the leaders around town and the great thinking in the space that that Potomac Institute brings to everything they do. It's my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker here today. His name is Bob Koloski. I had the pleasure of working with Bob in government. Bob is the lead for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's CISA National Risk Management Center at the Department of Homeland Security. He oversees the center's efforts to facilitate a strategic cross-sector risk management approach to cyber and physical threats to critical infrastructure. The center provides a central venue for government and industry to combine their knowledge and capabilities in a unique, collaborative, and forward-looking environment. The center's activities support both operational and strategic unified risk management efforts. Mr. Koloski's current position is a culmination of years of risk and resilience expertise. He most recently served as Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary for NPPD's Office of Infrastructure Protection before it became the CISA Infrastructure Security Division on November 16, 2018. While there, he led the coordinated national effort to reduce the risk posed by acts of terrorism and other cyber or physical threats to the nation's critical infrastructure, including soft targets and crowded spaces. I'm going to pause there and just say that Bob is a great partner to work with for everyone in government and for industry, and he's shown that over the years, and we're lucky to have him as a public servant. I'll pass it on to Bob.
Thanks. It's kind of amusing watching Ari have to struggle through reading my bio, so I appreciate it. Ari and I know each other best because we are both Little League parents in Upper Northwest, so we spend more of our time talking about Little League baseball than we do about 5G. So I hope we keep that equation going, right, Ari? Thanks for having me here today and the opportunity to talk to you all. Some of you I know and some of you new to working with. We appreciate having any opportunity to talk about the imperative around security and resilience as the 5G network continues to evolve. And I think evolution is the word that AT&T uses, I believe, in their commercials. So I'll use that. Earlier today, Brian, who's going to join us on the panel, was actually over doing something that we're doing at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency at the National Risk Management Center today, where we are actually hosting a Secure Tomorrow series meeting where we are pulling in some experts to help us think through future security risks, evolution of trends in technology and geopolitics, and doing some of the traditional scenario planning type things where you can imagine the world going in different directions and certain things happening, certain things not happening, and what are the implications from a security perspective? How can we make sure that we shape the security environment as much as possible, to the extent it's possible to shape a security environment, so that as we get to take advantage of new technologies, as new things roll out, as the competition amongst nation states continues to evolve, that it happens in such a way that it leaves the country, America, in a better place than it was before in terms of both economic opportunity and not taking on too much additional security risk. And so we invited a bunch of experts into the National Risk Management Center to go through a scenario planning exercise and work through some aspects. And Michael joined us for that this morning. And, I can think of no issue in a policy context right now that crystallizes the reason to do that kind of thinking more than the 5G network. This is something, this is a technology that's going to hit us between now and the next 7 or 8 years, and it's going to hit us relatively quickly, and it's going to create all kinds of opportunity out there, but it's also going to create new lines of security concerns. And so what we're trying to do within CISA as we work through this effort through some of the work we're doing at the National Risk Management Center is to make sure that we can be a positive force for ensuring that the 5G network, as it continues to evolve, as it rolls out, it happens as securely as possible with as much resilience in the system. And my remarks today are going to sort of talk on kind of our perspective on that question and where we think there's opportunity for positive interventions so that the 5G network is something that is as secure as it could be. So that's the framing I'd like to give for my remarks. But before I go into a little more deep conversation about 5G, let me tell you a little bit. I'm still at the point where I'd like to tell people about the National Risk Management Center. What we're trying to do in the National Risk Management Center as part of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency is be a hub for planning, analysis, and collaboration for the biggest strategic risks facing the nation. So what we want to do is bring together analytic capabilities and planning capabilities and the ability to bring representatives from across the interagency and across the interagency federal government, from state and local governments, from nonprofits, and from industry together to work pressing strategic risk issues. Again, 5G being an example of one of those. And we want to do it in an organized way where we build off a concerted effort to think through where critical infrastructure risk is, how it might change, where there are opportunities to buy down risk and create more security and resilience, ultimately for the purpose of national security and economic security. One of the first efforts we took on as part of the National Risk Management Center was to define a set of national critical functions. These are functions of the government and the private sector that are so vital to the United States that their disruption or destruction would have a debilitating effect on security, national economic security, and national public health or safety. Reducing the risk to these functions is a national security imperative. So what we're trying to do is understand what is truly critical at a functional level, where key dependencies and interdependencies lie, and the potential cascading impacts of threats will help us better understand where there are pockets of risk that from a national security perspective are ones where we want to focus our attention. The national critical functions construct takes the traditional critical infrastructure sector construct and turns it a little bit on its head and says it's not just about the sectors, it's about what it is that those sectors produce, whether it's generating electricity or the transport of key commodities or the ability to run a financial system, what it is they do and what contributes to that, and where are there opportunities, where is the risk in that system, where are there opportunities to reduce risk so that we can be sure that those functions are going to continue to function. So some of the examples of specific national critical functions we've identified are things like position, navigation, and timing services, the provision of identity management services, providing radio broadcast and access services, and the ability to operate core communications networks. I use those as examples, and these are all publicly available. The 55 national critical functions we've identified, they're publicly available on our website. But I use those as examples because those are certainly functions that the fifth generation of wireless technology, 5G, has the potential to greatly enhance how they're delivered. And so you look at the confluence of functions that are already crucial to our national security, our national economic security, and the evolution and the development of a 5G network, and you see that those functions are probably going to be delivered in slightly a different way. They're going to have perhaps new sources of risk in how they're delivered through the deployment of 5G, and we want to make that connection. And when we talk about making sure that the 5G network is secure, it is secure ultimately so the functions that are dependent on it, that are national imperatives, remain secure. So that's one of the reasons I think this is so important. The essence of what we do and that what we rely on is going to be changed in some ways through 5G technology. You all know better than I some of the statistics in terms of what 5G technology means in this order, but it means that we're going to do things a couple orders of magnitude faster. There's the ability to execute things a couple orders of magnitude faster with very low latency. And because of that, you're going to expand the devices that are connected to our communications networks, devices, many of which are captured through the phraseology of Internet of Things, that rely on doing things automatically through the ability to have communications that you can trust in and take advantage of data, et cetera. And all of a sudden, you see a whole new system architecture that is operating in a different way. It's our theory, right, and I think most of you agree with that, it's our theory as this architecture happens, there's going to be a new set of risks, but we want to make sure that those set of risks don't slow down the network rolling out in such a way that we can't take advantage of the wonder of the whole technology. So it's this mix of the economic activity and the innovation and some thinking through some of the national security risks that becomes important from a policy perspective. And so as we see data flowing, a couple orders of magnitude more of data flow, and as you see more things operating autonomously, allowing things to be more efficient and effective, whether it's transportation or agriculture, and whether the ability to exploit data to make better decisions, you see some things that are clearly things we should be rooting for and are very much in America's national interest. So we're going to have this new innovation, we're going to have new markets, we're going to have economic growth, and it's going to be a wonderful thing, as long as we do it with a way that we're not creating too much risk or too much national security concern. And so that's why this is an important strategic issue. So what we're trying to do and what we're trying to understand within CISA at DHS is, what are the sources of risk? How do you both understand how the core and the edge networks are going to function? How does that change the elements of how you think about this overall security of the 5G networks? Where does other components of how the networks are managed, more and more are going to go into the cloud? Are there new sources of risk as we become more reliant on cloud computing? What does the proliferation of software-defined network mean for security around software? And questions of things like radio access networks and securing the small and micro cells deployed in communities to enable rapid process of information packets. That's all changing infrastructure, right? That's, some of this is in place, some of this is in place already is helping us execute the 4G and other networks around there, but it's going to proliferate. It's going to create more connections. It's going to create more opportunities. Again, I think, as I've heard from industry in terms of understanding 5G risk, it's going to create more opportunities to isolate and segment and do things more nimbly and create redundancy, but it could also create connectivity risks in some of this. And so we've been working through trying to work with industry. We've sort of done our own independent assessment of where we think sources of risk may come from. We've collected feedback, particularly through the sector coordinating councils in place for the IT, information technology, and communications technology. And we've published a risk characterization at the TLP Amber level at this point that a number of you in this room have had an opportunity to comment at, which is an overarching view of our thoughts on 5G risk and some opportunities to address those risks. We are pushing out through similar processes to get to, so TLP Amber means that there's a level of information protection on it. It's not a classified document, but it is a document which we ask to be held pretty tightly within organizations that have a need to know. We're pushing to get an assessment out at the unclassified, fully TLP white level where it can be shared as a source of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's view on 5G risk. And we think starting to understand the sources of risk then point us in directions in terms of where are there technical areas to better study those things, where are there interconnectivity points, where can you see the connections with the national critical functions, as I was talking about, which focus us on a better understanding of the key components of the elements of risk associated with 5G, and then have a conversation about whether there's an opportunity at scale for the purpose of national and national economic security to make progress against those risks. That's how we're sort of thinking about where we are in the process, get a better understanding of the risks, and start to analyze and assess the risk and see the connection points between 5G risk, other things that we care about, and make recommendations and bring industry and government together to take steps to address some of those risks. So I will continue my remarks with talking about kind of how we're thinking about at a sort of strategic level some of the key vulnerabilities and some opportunities of things we're already doing to address those vulnerabilities, and where I see some opportunities in the future. So on the vulnerability side, as part of the risk assessment, we've talked about vulnerabilities in terms of three things: logistical vulnerabilities, physical vulnerabilities, and technical vulnerabilities. And the risk characterization we released pulls out more in those areas. But what I'm talking about in terms of logistical vulnerabilities are those vulnerabilities delivered via manufacturing and supply chains that are introduced by component parts of the 5G network that are either poorly manufactured or intentionally compromised or exploited via design flaws. And this is where 5G risk management interacts, particularly with some of the broader supply chain risk management efforts that we've taken across DHS with the IT and comm sector. Emil, who is here, is one of the fathers of a lot of the efforts we took across DHS. But we are increasingly looking for solutions to bring better information to bear, to put more trust into supply chains, to enhance and promote, incentivize better supply chain risk management across hardware and software components. That's for the broader ICT supply chain. The president issued an executive order asking the Secretary of Commerce to use special authorities to do that in some places, but there are areas where the Secretary of Commerce's authorities are not the right way to go at supply chain risk management. And what we're doing with the IT and comm sectors is not only supporting assessing where perhaps you want to use the emergency authorities that the Secretary of Commerce has in terms of rulemaking, but other ways that we can improve information sharing, information aggregation, risk understanding, and incentives for putting more trust into supply chains. That, again, is important across the ICT ecosystem, ICT supply chain ecosystem, but it becomes especially important if you think, as we do, obviously, that 5G is an important component of the evolving of ICT supply chains, and how do we make sure that there aren't new logistical vulnerabilities introduced through supply chains. Another area of vulnerabilities is physical vulnerabilities. And that's really around the idea that the 5G network greatly increases the core infrastructure of communication systems, and particularly the proliferation of small cells that need to remain functioning in a trustworthy manner. And so, again, physical vulnerabilities. The 5G network has many more access points with the cells and many more physical components that are going to demand some level of security at that level. And then finally, there are technical vulnerabilities, a lot of which do get carried over from the 3G and 4G networks, where you see that nation states who are interested to exploit technical flaws, where cybersecurity, cyber hygiene isn't at the level that you would hope, will keep going until they find those technical flaws. And so, some of the flaws in the system are flaws that existed through different generations, or potential flaws that existed through different generations of communications networks. Clearly, the new system will introduce some level of new technical vulnerabilities. And so, if you think about risk in those characterizations and understanding vulnerabilities, there's opportunity to intercede in those three areas. So that's how we're thinking about it. We do recognize that components of those vulnerabilities could be escalated, elevated. Those vulnerabilities could be elevated based on who the suppliers are within the system, who are the manufacturers of component pieces of the 5G network, and are there products that perhaps are less trustworthy at any purpose. Even from a physical vulnerability, is maintenance being done by a trusted group of folks who have responsibility for maintenance? Are there intentional technical vulnerabilities introduced in the system, or are there technical flaws in design introduced in the system? And from a logistical perspective, where are the supplies produced? That leads us to have some concern with suppliers who do business in China. It leads us to have some concern with companies that are beholden to government interest of China. So, that's always in a meeting like this when we're talking in Washington in a policy setting. There's the question of where we fit and how we think about companies that are subject to influence by the Chinese government, and perhaps there are other governments that we don't trust as much as others. And we don't want to shy away from that. We want to be fair to those companies, but if they are being unduly influenced by a government who is trying to undermine American national interests, we want to continue to look at that threat and understand whether there are vulnerabilities that are in the system that shouldn't be in the system, and are there ways to manage risks associated with those parts. And so that's what I'll say about, say about that for now, and I'm sure more of that will be discussed in the panel. So that's kind of how we're thinking about the risk at this point, and I will end with a frame of some of the activities that we're taking to help do what I said at the beginning that we hope to do at the National Risk Management Center: catalyze, inspire, organize activity to address those risks. And here I will use the organizing framework that was presented in the Prague proposals. So I think most of you know that earlier this spring, a number of governments, I guess 32 countries, met in Prague in a meeting hosted by the Czech Republic, including the EU and NATO, to talk through 5G security and some of the 5G networks, recognizing that this is a global evolution. The businesses that we're talking about, the companies that will be relying on 5G, the companies that will help build out the network, do business globally, and it's important that there's some level of international consensus, particularly around like-minded countries and big influential drivers of economic activity toward the concerns around 5G and how to address it. In the Prague proposals that came out, which the U.S. government signed on to, were around a series of proposals around policy, technology, economic levers, and security and privacy and resilience. And I think that's as good a way as any to organize a set of activities that we need to take as a U.S. government to advance the vision that I'm talking about. So, one of the things that we're trying to do and organize as a U.S. government is bring the departments and agencies who have something to do to promote a secure and resilient 5G network out, bring us together, make sure we're working together, and as I said, make sure as we hit the world internationally with our partners that there's a level of U.S. government consensus, and it's something that we can drive as much as possible to consensus of like-minded countries. And so on the policy end, most of our work right now, in terms of what I've been talking about, has been about advancing policies on reducing risks to supply chains and supply chains that will contribute to the 5G network. On the technology level, one of the things we're doing in CISA is, as we start to better characterize and understand the risk and seeing sources of where the risk might be introduced into the networks, can we help better understand the technical vulnerabilities through establishment of some testing of technical vulnerabilities to get deeper and understand component parts? And we're working with some of the vendors of some of the component parts of 5G networks to better understand their testing, their source of understanding, and to validate some of that for the purpose of our own risk understanding. In terms of economic levers, one of the things that I think as a U.S. government we can do is use incentives to make sure that as much as possible, companies of like-minded countries who want to do business in the space and that who we have faith in their security practices, they're meeting a level playing field. What are the reasons that companies that we might have more concern about trust are succeeding in the marketplace, and are there things where incentives can help balance that? And then are there things that we can do to encourage and incentivize different components, pieces of the 5G network to allow for avoiding things like vendor lock and dominance of the system because you're the only player in there? And so I think there's some economic policy and trade policy components of this. And then finally, on a security, privacy, and resilience, I do want to continue to push and hope that you hear in my remarks, we're pushing a risk management perspective to this, where any decision that's made out of security, privacy, or resilience concerns is one that takes into account a proper understanding of risk and not doing more to manage national security risk than needs to be done in such a way that it stifles the rollout of the network and the innovation associated with that. And so continuing to have this conversation in both a values and an economic construct as well as a security construct as you work through what the security decisions are within it, I think is an important element. So I will wrap up there, and I think we're going to take questions after the panel, and just say that I've said this before publicly that I'm encouraged that we're doing this. we're having this conversation at this level around town, places, with the Potomac Institute and Venable, and getting people in the room now where we still have some opportunities at the front end of the system to make real security progress. So we're not just sitting here 5 years from now that we've created a whole set of national security risks that we didn't think through. We could be a couple years more ahead than we are now, but we're not playing total catch up. And I think that's a good thing. And I think that should be a model as we continue to go forward. Anticipate tomorrow, anticipate what's going to happen, and get people in the room and start working the issues so that we're not just layering security on things, but we're thinking about designing security as we get it. So thank you.
Thanks, Bob. All I'll say about Little League is that we'll make sure to be done at 4 o'clock so you can make it to this semifinal game today that your son's in. So,
the game does start at 7, so I don't need to be 2.5 hours.
Let's call up the other panelists first. First is Brian Hendricks, who's head of policy and public affairs in the Americas region in Nokia. Mr. Hendricks has nearly 2 decades of regulatory and legislative experience dealing with technology and policy issues in the private sector as a senior congressional staffer and as a law enforcement lawyer with the Federal Communications Commission. And then our other panelist is Tom Donahue, who retired from the CIA recently after 32 years of service there. And he served as the chief editor of the President's Daily Brief and other CIA daily production during the second term of the Clinton administration. And he spent the last 18 years of his career focused on cyber threats as a manager and senior analyst in what is now known as the Center for Cyber Intelligence. He served 4 years at the White House during the Bush and Obama administrations, most recently as the Senior Director for Cyber Operations and for the National Security Council staff. During his last 2 years, he was Research Director at the DNI's Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center. And lastly, I'm going to bring up Dr. Michael Fritz, who is the Vice President at the Potomac Institute, and he's going to moderate the session and will tell us a little bit about the Potomac Institute's work here. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Ari. Actually, Bree just walked out. I wanted to thank both Ari and Bree for a long-term, really very productive collaboration that Potomac and Venable have had over the years on policy issues that are relevant in both the legal perspective and to think tanks. So thanks, Ari. I hope we have many years to work together on these things. We're much more powerful working together. Quickly, Potomac Institute it's a nonprofit, independent science and technology think tank, nonpartisan. I forgot to add that one. Each word means something. I won't bore you with all the details, but basically we do strategic policy advice for government, often senior government officials, heavily Defense Department, but we do a number of other departments as well. We try to put policy ideas or alternatives in front of decision makers. That's kind of the one-sentence summary of what think tanks do in case people don't know. I personally am a techno geek, so I've done technology and microelectronics for many decades. I'm now in the policy world the last couple of years, so this is actually exciting and new for me, and I get a much more diverse group of people, which is a lot of fun. One quick word about why Potomac is involved with Venable on this. We have a number of academic centers. We have a space center, which there was a recent event, and we have some military centers. We also have a vital infrastructure security center, and that uses some of our security expertise in sort of a general critical infrastructure protection role. And I manage the Vital Center, among other responsibilities, and our job and what we've been doing in having events, and by the way, this is one of a series of events that we're going to put on this topic, is to do deep dives in critical infrastructure security and supply chain and extract useful policy relevant items that come out of those. And so don't think this event will cover everything. It won't. It will cover some really interesting perspectives. It is nowhere near sufficient, so we're going to have a couple of these and distill the results that we have from them. So with that, I will get out of the way, I guess, I can let the speakers come in and make some initial remarks. We've already heard from Bob Kolowski at Homeland Security. I think Brian is next, right, for the opening remarks before we proceed to hopefully a very vigorous panel discussion.
Do you want us up there or from here?
It doesn't matter as long as people can hear you.
As
long as people can hear you.
All right, let's just do it from here. It'll be easier for everybody. Thank you to both Venable and the Potomac Institute for the invitation to come here and speak with you today. I was fortunate to come and speak at an event between the two entities last year and had a very good time, so we're very eager to be back. Recognizing that we are just one panel among a series of events, what I thought would be most useful for me from the vendor perspective is to make sure that we have a grounding for the ways in which 5G is different. Part of the reason for that is that as we travel around town, what we have seen in the way here and indeed internationally, some of the ideas that have been cast about, we think fundamentally misunderstand the ways in which 5G will be different and the ways in which security approaches and assumptions that could be made about appropriate security approaches based on a backward-looking understanding of LTE and 3G are not accurate. So you have heard that 5G is different, but it really truly is. It's different in a number of ways. It's different in its architecture. You already heard Mr. Glosky talk a little bit about the use of both macro cells and a huge amount of small cell infrastructure for densification, software-defined networking, which has some implications for how you can mitigate risk, particularly when, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, you look at issues like post-development testing and certification, which have been suggested, and how that can be a logistical challenge. Different capabilities for sure. And also a different and exponentially larger potential attack surface, what cyber folks talk about as the attack surface, which is kind of a cool phrase. But I'll talk a little bit about why that attack surface is much greater. A third way in which 5G is different is that because of what it will enable. And I'll talk a little bit about this in a couple of minutes. And that is that for previous generations of wireless, the primary driver was the consumer use case, with voice, text, and data as the objective. Although with advanced LTE, we did start looking at enterprise applications. The truth is that for a variety of technical reasons, what we were able to do, the use cases that we were able to support, based on spectrum and equipment that was available, meant that it was primarily a consumer demand-driven focus. We will now in 5G have far more capability, which will invite entire sectors to utilize the wireless infrastructure, everything from connected healthcare, connected car, autonomous driving vehicles, et cetera. So what you get there with the introduction of significant utilization by new sectors is a different target environment than what we had in previous generations of wireless. The good news is that we have been aware of these challenges for some time, and we have spent considerable time addressing previous weaknesses. It's not like we started a year ago in the standardization bodies, for example, talking about security. We've been having these conversations, for 4 or 5 years about where we left holes in LTE, as an example, and things that needed to be done differently to address that framework. And so, we have identified ways to use prior approaches and prior tools that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, but also recognizing the need for additional approaches and tools given the different threat environment. So I already mentioned that we were looking backward, primarily building for a consumer use case. But compelling use cases like networked hospitals, so think about sensor-based technologies to track employees and equipment, connected infrastructure, and even connected car were supported technically, but as I mentioned, we couldn't scale those up given the limitations in capacity and latency in LTE networks. So a lot of the demand for that has been spinning up and queuing up, waiting for advancements in technology, mostly in the radio layer, and changes in spectrum allocation, frankly, to give us much larger channel blocks so that we're going to be able to have really high throughput through the radio interfaces. The radio is no longer going to be a bottleneck. We're going to move quickly from speeds that can top out in most networks at 100 megabits per second which is pretty high for LTE, to initial speeds of 1 gigabit to 2 gigabits per second, and scaling up to 10 to 20 gigabits per second. So you're going to see initially a tenfold, and then eventually up to a many times that increase in the amount of throughput. But also latency, which is an important driver, will move from 40 to 100 milliseconds per network. It's even higher in cable plant, down to 1 second or less. So now you have high reliability, high throughput, very limited latency, and a whole bunch of new use cases that are possible at scale. But a lot of those will make use of IoT devices that the keynote identified. And one thing to keep in mind is that another key difference between 5G and previous generations of wireless technology is that we had a limited number of device makers in that space. Not all of them were of the highest quality, but many of them, those which are the most widely used by consumers, have heritage and experience with developing secure devices. We will have many new players introducing often very inexpensive IoT devices with very limited experience in securing them. Our threat detection and mitigation Center for Nokia, this is a public report that people can look at, among other things, identifies that today the average IoT device that is deployed on a network is corrupted within 2.5 minutes of being discovered for the first time on a network. When you consider that you're going to have many billions of less secure devices on a network, presenting both attractiveness for the data purposes, but also for recruitment into huge bots with a capability set that will dwarf what we have seen to date, and the new sectors that I mentioned, including transportation, utility management, healthcare, and infrastructure maintenance, making heavy use of the networks and creating higher value targets. So the bottom line is lots of new capabilities coming at us, but also some significant risks that we need to be prepared to address. So what can policymakers do is one of the things that we are asked, and I will talk a little bit about some things that we're not particularly supportive of that we hear being talked about that we think yield a pretty minimal security dividend, but there are some things that we think are good approaches, some of which are already underway. But we think that the conversation needs to be grounded in the actual vulnerabilities and knowledge of what 5G is and how it's different, which is kind of why I started where I started. Now, policymakers should and must insist upon trustworthiness and security from all sectors. Equipment and software suppliers and device makers with the heritage and reputation for security are going to continue to play a big role in 5G, and that's the good news. The bad news is there's going to be an influx of new component makers, device makers, software suppliers, and even in some limited niches, network equipment suppliers. In pursuit of security, one of the hallmarks we believe needs to be fairness and consistency in government policy and enforcement. Companies like Nokia, with our 154-year heritage of ethical conduct and compliance, are often at a disadvantage when we face competitors who show less fidelity to domestic rules and laws. And as one example, I will point to the recent headlines about the Commerce Department's decision to enforce its export control regulations against a couple of companies in the last 2 years. I'm sure you can guess which two companies I'm talking about. But these are predicated on systemic long-term violations of U.S. export controls and sanction rules that the rest of us comply with at great cost, at great expense, and often at great disadvantage because while they do a wonderful job, it can take many months, depending on the complexity of the licenses that we are seeking, to get those licenses. So it confers upon those who compete with us a time-to-market advantage. So when you have identified entities which have serially violated these rules, it's important that you actually follow through on your sanctions. If you ameliorate penalties without first insisting upon changed conduct and behavior, it in effect rewards the behavior, but it also provides absolutely no incentive for a change in behavior prospectively and restores those competitive imbalances. Asymmetric expectations and rules that impact the competitiveness of companies that are lawful and don't cut corners is going to compromise security. So let's be consistent and let's be fair. So simply put, a threshold element of establishing trustworthiness in your supply chain is insisting that the entities that supply your critical equipment and services behave in a lawful manner every day, and that they're punished when they don't. Following the law is just one element of establishing trustworthiness. The other is transparency. It is fair and it is reasonable for policymakers to ask all suppliers of critical equipment and services about your ownership, your governance, including the manner in which you make your decisions. That includes your supply chain management. That includes the things that you have introduced to mitigate against risk. They're tough questions to answer at times, but they're important questions, and we think that those are important conversations to have. Unfortunately, a lot of times what we have gotten, and it's not necessarily the U.S., is we'll show up, there will be a critique of our supply chain, and there will be, and here's what we plan to do about it, as opposed to asking, so if we have concerns about where you source components, here are the components we're concerned about, and here's why we're concerned about them. What programs do you have in place so that there can be an exchange? Because where I source, mounting harnesses and screws is not a matter of national security. We need to have a little bit more precise definition of what we're concerned about. Is it intelligent components? What are those? Is it software development? What programs do companies have in place to ensure the integrity of software development? That may mean where you develop it is less important than how you develop it. But those are fair conversations, and vendors and suppliers of services need to be prepared to answer them. And then we can have a comparison and an effective dialogue on how to address those concerns. Simply asking us to move a supply chain is not a reasonable approach at this point, particularly not when you want the deployments to continue. But I am encouraged recently, particularly with the U.S. government approach to understanding supply chain risk. There are a lot of things in addition to insisting on transparency and security that we think governments can do. One way is to increase and improve particularly U.S. government participation and standardization. We've heard a lot of discussion about the Chinese increased participation level in standardization, which we don't think is necessarily by itself cause for alarm or concern. When you consider that 4 or 5 years ago, the conversation was, geez, they're not participating in standardization, and we looked like we might have regional approaches to defining standards, which defeated scale and created a whole bunch of other problems. If the concern is the sheer volume of participation, then the answer isn't to expel them from standardization. It's to find ways to increase the participation rate among U.S. entities, which has sagged considerably. We have very limited participation from auto OEMs and other vertical industries that are going to be heavily dependent on 5G technology, either because they haven't seen the need, or in some cases we also see very limited participation from small and mid-sized companies. And one reason for that is obviously the cost of obtaining the voting rights for places like 3GPP. So one of the suggestions that we've made to the administration repeatedly is finding ways to reduce the cost of participation in standardization, whether that's through favorable tax treatment or its direct engagement with the accrediting bodies to get them to tier their membership so that smaller entities have an opportunity to participate. But also using NIST and other government participants to convene dialogues post and pre plenary sessions to compare notes and make sure that what we get at the end of the day is still the best engineering-based outcomes from standards bodies. We also think that there needs to be an implementation of a framework for recognizing companies with superior security records, and as Mr. Kowalski said at the beginning, to incentivize others, particularly those who are new to the space and don't have heritage here, to adopt and follow those best practices. Part of that may mean providing funding for training, particularly for smaller network operators and IoT companies, to improve the security departments and practices and to expand the tools that they have, because they can be very expensive. Particularly since we will often see a situation where a standards body will produce strong recommendations, and I'm building to comply with the standard, but not all operators will implement the full toolkit of security provisions which have been developed. The large ones can speak for themselves why they don't do that. In some cases, the smaller operators simply might not be able to afford all of the features. So there's an opportunity to look there. But at the same time, we have seen some suggestions that we don't believe are appropriate. We don't think that they necessarily yield a security dividend. They may yield a political dividend, given the nature of the current international conversation, one of which is building expensive security centers for post-development testing and certification, as we have seen done in Canada and as we have seen done in the UK. What we would tell you, based on our examination of the reports coming out of those, is that their utility is fairly limited. They've been quite effective at finding quality deficiencies, but even their own reports indicate the difficulty in keeping up with the volume of updates that have happened or producing remediation. 5G will be different in the amount of software that will be driving a network. Gone are the days where you'll get a once a quarter or once a half release updating the technology. These will be weekly, and in some cases they might even be nightly. The idea that we can build a pre-deployment testing regime without causing significant issues in deployment of needed software upgrades is very difficult for us to imagine. We have no trouble with the concept of sharing source code and taking a look at those things after deployment, but that has to be taken into account. 5G is just going to be different, and that type of regime has significant limitations. Network segregation is another concept that we have heard kicked around a lot, and realizing that this may sound completely self-interested, we've had some difficulty understanding the ways in which some have suggested that if you don't trust a particular supplier or multiple suppliers, you can let them in one part of a network but not another. We think that fundamentally misunderstands the way that 5G is architected and will ultimately operate. For example, it is our belief that a lot of traffic is never going to pass through a core in a wireless network in 5G. It's all going to stay at the radio layer in a particular region as you have more and more infrastructure and services communicating with one another. And even if that weren't true, the idea that having a trusted supplier in the core could be a miracle cure for vulnerabilities that were deliberately introduced into the radio layer seems to us unsupportable from a technical perspective. The key servers for encryption are hosted in the core, but anyone who is in the radio layer who has interest in intercepting those keys by virtue of being there would be in a position to do that and potentially cause problems with the integrity of the security at the radio layer. It's also important to recognize that as a standard practice in telecommunications network, we don't encrypt all the way through a network. We encrypt between the user and the radio plane, but often not throughout the network. So what happens at the radio layer is pretty important. Which brings us back to the question, if you have reason not to trust someone as a supplier, and not because they're just having poor quality, but because you actually fundamentally don't trust that supplier has the best interests of the ecosystem in mind, then it's probably best not to allow that supplier to be deployed at all. That would include us if you don't trust our abilities to do things. Lastly, I would just like to say that having spoken about the ways that 5G will be different, we think that there are, nevertheless, a lot of very constructive things that can be done. I've talked about insisting on transparency and recognizing and facilitating best practices, providing resources for training, and increased role in standardization, particularly as standardization goes to make sure that standardization continues to address security concerns which are raised in a very timely way. I will say this about standardization is that in previous generations, security was handled, but often not as the highest level priority compared to dealing with other aspects. In 5G, it has been prioritized to a much higher degree, but continuing to insist on identifying issues and pushing them through development and release is extremely important. And with that, I'm happy to address any of the questions that folks have.
Hello? It's on. Hello? Oh, fantastic. Okay. I don't like to moderate from sitting up there. It's much better to be able to look at the speakers. So that's good. So let's hold the questions after the speakers have all made their remarks. I think things work much better that way. So with that, we'll move on to Tom's opening remarks, and then we'll move to the interactive part of the event.
So I'd like to pile on a little bit on Ryan's comments, and then before I even launch into what I prepared, which is on the inspection regime. I think that's a failed concept, just from the point of view that not only can you not find the problem in the thing that you're looking at, but in fact you actually have to look at every single piece of equipment that's going to be deployed. Because who's to say that the thing you're looking at has anything to do with what's going to be deployed? In fact, that's one of the problems the Brits have had is that is version control. Everything keeps changing. Another issue here is, and this brings us back to the trust issue, which is this notion that we're fundamentally talking about a lot of software, but we're also talking fundamentally about hardware. And so we're really talking about the actual root of trust. And if you look back at industry experience through the Trusted Computing Group and whatnot, I think industry has consistently found that if you don't trust the hardware, you're doomed. And then when you look at who's going to be in the best position to cause you a problem, then you need to look at, in my mind, looking at the individual components is not the most productive place to be evil. The best place to be evil is to be the integrator. And so you really need to trust the person who's pulling it all together, because a lot of what is going to be the capability that somebody might use against you is in fact going to be the features that are built into the system. And it's just a question of steering the features to a particular purpose on a particular time period that you may not have anticipated in your initial deployment. And then, of course, there's the issue of updates and whether or not an inspection regime would actually keep up with every single update, never mind, God help me, nightly. But anyway, the notion that, you could have a bunch of features pre-positioned and then there's just one final update, which by itself looks just fine if you don't understand how it will interact with all the features, isn't a problem. So that keeps bringing us back to this notion of trust. One question I have that I don't have an answer to is to the people who are talking about, well, can I have a little bit over here that may, touching the network? What is it from as a security question? That one of the things people need to understand is what does even a small footprint within your infrastructure give you in terms of being able to reach across and have impact across the entire network? Is it enough to be able to touch what you might think of as a signaling or control plane? In other words, into the trusted communications that are occurring across the management of the entire network. Is that in and of itself already a problem? And now you're just using other people's features to do whatever you want to do. One last technical comment, which is to reinforce what Brian was saying about the edge versus the core issue, which is latency. How do you think they're going to get 1 millisecond of latency? It isn't going to be by going all the way back to the core. It's going to be about having all the intelligence distributed everywhere across the edge. And that's why the edge is going to matter, and the notion of keeping somebody out of the core is just nonsense. So I'm a former government person, and so I'm primarily, in some sense, speaking to my former colleagues who remain in the government. As this is not a new issue. I'm thrilled that we're having the conversation now and not 5 years from now, but you know what? We should have had this conversation 5 years ago. And in fact, actually 10 years ago, in my view. And in fact, there were conversations, but it was just too hard for government to look too far ahead of a problem. We just don't do it. I'm sorry. It's like, no, what's today's crisis? What's happening next week? Never mind 5 years from now, never mind 10 years from now. But here we are. And a lot of people say, well, it's too late. This, 5G, it's all set. We're kind of, the market's set. The standards are kind of set. It's just a question of rolling it out now. Well, I disagree with that too. I think this is something that's going to take time to roll out, and particularly in terms of how it's going to manifest itself across our entire infrastructure. We have some time to make some decisions, but at the same time, it is, in fact, we are on the edge here of the cliff, and there are people who are making very hard to revoke decisions about the baseline pieces of the infrastructure. So if we're going to do anything, we bloody well better do it now. I sure don't want to be coming back 10 years from now and having this conversation about 6G or 7G or whatever the heck we're going to be talking about. But let's get our minds wrapped around this now. So originally, when this panel was set up, there was supposed to be somebody from DoD here, I think. So I'm going to channel the DoD person a little bit today. I'm representing only my view. I'm not representing DoD's view in any way, stretch, or form, or any other part of the government. But I'm just a former old guy lamenting the failures of his career now. So here's the thing. A lot of the conversation that we're having around 5G right now has a very much of a domestic, U.S.-centered focus to it. In my mind, that's already the wrong conversation. This is a global conversation. The reason it's a global conversation is because we, the United States, are a global power. We, the United States government, have a responsibility to the American people to be able to project power to protect U.S. national interests everywhere around the planet. And so to have a policy that successfully keeps Huawei or anybody else out of the U.S. marketplace is insufficient, because I need to have resilient command and control all the way from here to anywhere. And if I have to go through somebody else's equipment that I don't trust on the way, I've got a problem, because it's probably not going to be there for me. Which leads me to the second point, which is a lot of this conversation is about espionage. Okay, I get it. Lots of opportunities. I think Brian articulated those. Yes, Brian will not give you end-to-end encryption, but you can give yourself end-to-end encryption. You should be doing that anyway, so just get on with it. I recognize that, again, there's all sorts of other interesting things you can do in terms of watching traffic, even if you can't read it, and, you can think about who's talking to whom and all that kind of stuff. Great, we should worry about all that. But from my point of view, the thing I'm worried about is not every day. I'm not worried about the routine day. I'm worried about the worst day. This is what the taxpayers pay the American government to think about, because nobody else will, nobody else can, nobody else can afford to. And that is the worst possible day when we are in a strategic conflict with a peer adversary. Our communications need to work across our nation through our critical infrastructure as we mobilize, and we need to be able to talk reliably to all of our forces anywhere in the world. So this is not even just a 5G issue. This is really about what is our strategy for having resilient communications, end-to-end, edge, core, 5G, 6G, 4G, I don't care whatever it is, it's all got to work. So, well, we got satellites. Maybe not on the worst possible day. We need to think about that. Do we have the right mixture of stuff to do what we need to do? So if you step back and say, well, what are we doing here in the U.S. government about this? I think there's some areas where we could improve. And primarily, in the government, we like to talk a lot about innovation. And we somehow, this is a sort of a relatively light touch kind of approach where we don't feel like we're meddling with the market, and we don't feel like we're going to be seen as, the government is being seen as somehow meddling in the private sector in an inappropriate manner. And it's like, yep, okay, I'm great on the innovation thing. But if you look at how are we, the U.S. government, supporting innovation, I would argue it is very unfocused. It has no particular purpose to it. And it tends to be way somewhere over the horizon somewhere, and it has absolutely no focus on helping what's going on in terms of our current day problems, in terms of what makes up into our infrastructure. If you look at what's going on in the private sector in innovation, Nokia and Ericsson are dumping lots of money into their research and development. Very healthy percentage by any standard. But guess what? Their budgets combined don't equal the amount of money that Huawei's putting in today, and Huawei's already said they're going to put in more. I think there's an opportunity here for the U.S. government to think harder about what we're doing in terms of doing innovation for critical infrastructure such that it will be reliable and secure and serve our purposes, maybe to help mitigate in an untrusted environment, but better yet, help us and help industry get to the point where they, in fact, have an advantage and can compete in the marketplace using the best possible technology. I would also note that, if you look at in Europe, there is money. I believe you guys are got a big grant from the EU. It's like a loan kind of thing, right? So they put $500 million down. That's still chump change. Okay, we're talking. Huawei's putting in, numbers on the order of going to be putting in $15-20 billion a year into R&D. $500 million over 5 years is chump change. What the U.S. government needs fundamentally is a comprehensive, systematic approach with a roadmap to thinking about this industry. We're very reactive. We keep hoping for certain things to happen like emergency preparedness, that will have priority when we need it, so on and so forth. But it always comes down, hey, industry, by the way, that thing that you've built, is there anything you can give us for free? I'd surely like to have some. Okay, I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but I'm trying to make a point. And so I would say, no, we need to be looking ahead. We need to be thinking about how the architecture is going to support our national needs domestically and globally, and we need to have a plan for how that's going to work. To do that, in part, we're going to require a much more sophisticated understanding of the market than I tend to at least saw during my career within the government, and what drives us to get to the places we end up to. Here in the United States, if you look, we have a lot. You have to ask the question, how did we get to where we are today? We had industry that was so-called U.S. industry, and there's an interesting question, what does that mean, U.S. industry nowadays? But we had things, and we had policies that I would argue interacted with the marketplace, interacted with business decision-making, and interacted with economic cycles. And the net result was we're talking about companies that are not U.S. companies. And a fundamental policy question is going to be, is that where we want to be? And I don't have I think there are multiple answers to this question, but I think we're taking a very passive approach and just kind of hoping that things will turn out in a way that's not too bad for us. So the U.S. government fundamentally needs to do is pick champions. The easiest thing to do would be to say, we love Nokia, we love Ericsson, we've already got a lot of their stuff, let's really get behind them. And that could mean, again, investment in research and development. It could mean other forms of much more aggressive kinds of investment to provide in ways that we've done in other sectors of the U.S. economy. It could involve, for example, doing things that we've done with the aviation industry and showing up with these companies when they go around the world to sell their products and say, hey, by the way, you buy that stuff, we're going to throw in some special U.S. government magic, no extra charge here. Or we're going to throw in some financing. We have the Exim Bank. The amount of money the Exim Bank spends nowadays is pretty small in the context of this conversation. But that's an avenue that we could approach. If these are the people we trust, then let's get behind them. And when you consider that these companies actually are multinational companies with big footprints in the United States, and in some cases with big historical footprints dating back to U.S. industry, we could just say that we're going to get behind this. And if that's not good enough for you in terms of, no, it's got to be an American, they all got to be waving little American flags, well, fine. Then let's figure out how to fix that which we broke 20 years ago. The other thing to think about with current policy is that what are we doing to the high-tech industry writ large? I believe there's a meeting today at the White House in which various people from CEOs from the high-tech industry are meeting with Secretary of Treasury and with the head of the Economic Council, and maybe the president's dropping in. And they're basically going to go, oh my gosh, the amount of uncertainty that you've thrown into our lives, the amount of potential denial of marketplace that your policy is going to create is just going to destroy our bottom line. Which brings us back to the issue of U.S. government investing in innovation. Again, we have taken a very passive view about this. We have to remember that where did Silicon Valley actually come from? Silicon Valley is the result of the defense industrial base going like gangbusters working with Stanford on air defense. And then, oh, by the way, there's these useful things, these widgets that we eventually called computers that was used in the air defense, and then eventually, the semiconductor people showed up, and blah, 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 the magic begins to happen. But there's been a tremendous amount of government involvement in innovation that we have essentially walked away from about 20, 25 years ago. When the internet was created, we basically took our hands off the steering wheel when I say internet was created, what I mean is we turned the ARPANET over to and commercialized it, right? The thing that the government created. We took our hands off the steering wheel and said, "Oh, over to you. It's all about markets." Well, I'm sorry, no, it isn't. That's just not been the history. That's not the reality. We need to face up to the reality, and the United States government needs to step up and put some serious money on the table somewhere if they want to have any influence on this. Whining in policy is not going to get you to a favorable outcome. I'm sorry. Enough. Thank you.
I guess there's a lag. Okay. Thank you very much for very frank comments and stimulating comments. I'm going to take a prerogative and just sort of maybe ask the first question, since I'm in a position to ask the first question, and when the mind is percolating based on what everyone has said. So it's going to be a little bit techno-oriented, but there is a policy perspective, because it sort of builds on what Tom just said. I want to understand, and maybe ask the other speakers, how we got to the situation that we are today, where a lot of foreign domination, and we may not actually control 5G and things like this. Because I know in my own career, I did a tour at DARPA. A lot of the early technologies of doing really low-cost, high-performance silicon, which I would argue enable 5G in the first place, the U.S. government owned that space, and they certainly owned that space for defense, for the military. Our military radars and EW systems and stuff like that, very powerful. So we owned that space compared to the rest of the world. How did we get to, I know you've addressed elements of it, Tom, but how did we get to a situation where we started by doing robust government investment in research, owning the military implementation, but now as it becomes commercial, we're at the cusp of possibly losing it? So how did that, and Tom, you've already addressed elements of this, but how did this state of affairs occur?
If I could just throw in one more piece on top of what I just said, which was that there's a memo somewhere in DOD which basically said, buy commercial.
When I started my professional career, the buzzword was COTS. So rebuild your radar box or rebuild your analysis tool and everything. Build it in COTS, and it'll be cheaper and better.
Because there was a point where commercial technology, frankly, was better, got better.
Yeah.
Right? They invested, it got better. I'm not saying COTS is bad. I'm just saying, but if we're going to go down that road, then we need to get on the train and go down with it, not just sit back passively and then complain about the answer at the end.
Yeah, to me, it's personally frustrating, because this is an area that we started and we owned in the military space. So I don't want to turn it over to the audience, but any comments from Brian or Bob on how we got to today's state of affairs?
Well, one comment on maybe how we got to the state of affairs, but maybe two comments on how we get out of the situation that we're in as well. One thing to consider is that at least with respect to the hardware side of things, it's a very tough business. Standardization is critical in developing scale, but it also commoditizes the products to a major degree. That was okay for a while, but now we're dealing with competitors who have some advantages that exploit that fact, that make it very difficult. So getting out of it from a hardware perspective, it's probably unrealistic to expect the United States is going to develop from the ground up a hardware champion. In fact, we saw lots of consolidation happen with Nortel and Lucent and other prior champions being absorbed into companies like, frankly, Nokia, Alcatel-Lucent, who we bought. And that's a factor, and it's driven in large measure by the limitations in what you can do from a commodity perspective. But two things that are interesting is, one, we have some conversations going on with DoD and others now. We didn't not that long ago. And there's a framework for discussion with the National Spectrum Consortium and others, if we put real money into it, to talk about ways that you move away from just, I want to sell you the same base station that I'm selling T-Mobile, and developing things, whether it's for unique things to help on the flight line, technologies that quite honestly can produce breakthroughs and innovations that will become part of 6G. But also something that people should be very concerned about right now is this use case concept, where we keep talking hypothetically about use cases, but we haven't necessarily seen a lot of them arriving in the marketplace yet. If you take a look, for example, at iCreate, which is a policy that India has of creating small networked cities which will become incubators for those use cases by inviting in investment from lots of companies like Nokia, like operators, like IoT companies, cloud, edge, web analytics, but with considerable government work to create these kinds of environments. Those are going to be the living labs that create huge innovation for the future, and may mean use cases arrive in Asia before they come here. There's a real opportunity for the U.S. to do that here. I know you have some cities who are willing to look at doing that, eager to create streamlining of siting and infrastructure policy. If the government was willing to act as a convener and an investor to bring these together, then we could have living labs in the U.S. that drive the next generation of innovation. But that doesn't appear to be a prescription that's being thought about right now.
And whereas in China, they are, right? China's got smart cities initiatives. They're also tying this to their road and belt initiatives to spread this to other countries.
So, Bob, any comments about how we got to this stage?
You know, it's a good question and one that I would prefer to be asking than answering because it's worth learning from and learning what the lessons are for future policy making versus things. But one thing that occurs to me that we talk about often is one of the contributing factors to getting to where we are today is that security wasn't valued into this process and wasn't valued as part of the evolutionary process of communications networks. And when you have something that's not valued, it doesn't get priced in. It doesn't. You don't think about ways to use policy interventions to get to that. And it's, as I sort of ended my remarks, and too often we cheerlead the innovation, the technology and the development, and then we figure out, okay, what's the security consideration that's been created by that? And if you at least reverse that equation a little bit, that it's all at the same time, you can try to put value in, and then you can try to think about what the right intervention is.
Well, thanks. So I don't want to hog the mic here. So let's go to the audience, and here you can come up to the stand.
Thank you. My name is Roger Cochetti. I work with venture capital and private equity in the technology sector, but spent most of my career as an executive with ComSat, IBM, VeriSign, different technology companies. So first, I should say, not expressing my own view, but how the technology industry would react to Tom's lament that, hey, we gave you everything, now you owe us something in return. And I'm sorry to tell you that the normal industry reaction to this, do not tell me what you did for me yesterday, and much less do I want to hear what you did for me 25 years ago before I was even born. So no, there is no sympathy for that. We're out for ourselves, and that's the way the industry works. But I think that if I try to combine Brian's comment that the attack surface is going to increase by orders of magnitude in the technology with Tom's comment that the connectivity issues are going to increase globally in order for us to defend our position also by orders of magnitude, and then add into that by the middle of the next decade, we're going to get quantum computing, which will make virtually any encryption technology we have today worthless. So the future simply looks impossible. And I don't know why we don't just conclude, I guess, as the British Admiralty did at some point, we simply can't protect the high seas. We just, we can't be the global protector of the high seas. That's not going to happen. We don't have enough people in England or ships in England to do it. So we're just going to pull back to what we can do instead of pretending that we're going to spend tens or hundreds of trillions of dollars and beating up all of our allies in every other country in the world to do what we can't do. It's not that it's not theoretically possible to provide the global comprehensive security structure for 5G that we're talking about. Theoretically, it is possible. I think we'll have to just go bankrupt to do it, but that's okay. We can have, so I don't know. The future does not look bright, and nothing that the panel has said makes it look any brighter, because the problem is just so enormous that I don't see how it can be tackled. Thank you.
Sobering. I would add two things to what you said. because I would agree on the post-quantum networking is something that very little, actually next to none, attention is being focused on. That organically is something, honestly, that the government probably will need to be a little shoving on, because we'll look at it too, but there's not an immediate commercial application for it, so industry is going to be slow to get to that point. But imagine a scenario in which the encryption ciphers aren't as valuable anymore, and your adversary has already adopted quantum communication systems of their own, limiting your ability to surveil what they're doing. So there's a major threat coming there. I don't know the answer to the question about let's just resign ourselves to what we can't. There are too many things we can do that we aren't doing, which is the place I'd like to start. I mean, I think that taking an inventory of the tools that we have to protect 5G now, as opposed to doing what we have in the past, at least this is my view. A lot of times industry will design things and use standardization to promote ubiquity and speed of deployment. Internet comes to mind, right? We were all about making sure that we had interconnection protocol, common protocols, because we wanted it to be widely distributed. Security wasn't a total afterthought, but it didn't go into the mix on the front end, and we've seen the limitations of trying to overlay security after the fact on top of that. So we shouldn't extrapolate that same problem to the way that we're designing the next generation of communications networks, and to think a little bit more about how security can be designed in. We think we're comparatively good at it. We think we've been thinking about 5G a lot, and about how you can do things like, with network slicing, design different security for different slices that have different purposes. We'll have the ability to differentiate how we approach security. We'll have adaptive and automated security response and self-healing networks. And these are huge advancements over what we had in the past, but they're not sufficient to address the full nature of the problem that you're describing. There probably does need to be a more active government role in stimulating industry to look at different questions that don't today have an immediate commercial opportunity for us.
And I'd just like to add, I mean, in terms of actual research and innovation, we're still pretty strong. I mean, there's a lot known on gigahertz and terahertz RF systems, maybe not in U.S. like telecom companies, but we, as a country, we have a lot of expertise there. So I'm somewhat hopeful if we get our act together, if we're scared straight, so to speak. Any other comments on the last question? Or
So I don't think we're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars here. I'll settle for like 200 billion, something like that. I've heard people say, yeah, we could do that one of those, work fund things, raising money things on the internet, maybe. I would also be careful about leaping completely, slicing your wrists over quantum computing. I think that the application of quantum computing towards evil is not going to be as trivial as it's not going to be magic. And there is work being done on quantum-resistant cryptography. There's going to be a pucker factor someday when somebody finally actually pops a useful machine out the door, but then it's going to take time for that to become something useful, and there's going to be time for infrastructure to respond to that. The notion that we should just repeat the British experiment and failed empire, the British led telecommunications in a global sense at the turn of around the 1900s, with help from American entrepreneurs, I might add. But it was the fact that they were drained by 2 world wars that they eventually gave up. Are we going to go down in history saying, well, we were kind of tired after Iraq and Afghanistan and we gave up our position as the leading democracy in the planet? I don't think so. We shouldn't in any case.
And I started talking about kind of what we're thinking about in terms of secure tomorrow and scenario thinking and all that. And there are both pluses and minuses in using historical analogy and looking back and learning from things. But clearly, there's plenty of history where somebody could have asked the same question you just asked about something else that should cause us to throw up our arms and just assume that we'll never be able to solve it. And so far so good in terms of combinations of analysis and innovation and some policy interventions, and then strategic thinking gets us to periods of stability. And I think, again, as long as the U.S. government's paying me, I'm not going to throw up my arms and give up here. But I think you're right to try to push us toward, one of the one of the parts of your question is to push us towards strategic thinking and understanding the things that maybe we can't control and accepting and trying to operate within the things we can't control as opposed to trying to solve things that we can't put the genie back at the bottom.
Hi, Anita Balachandra from TechVision 21. Could you all take a step back and talk a little bit about spectrum and spectrum allocation challenges or issues? Is it true that the area that's most favorable for a 5G development deployment is really not available for commercial use in this country, but outside of this country, most others are focusing on this sub-6 gigahertz portion of the spectrum, that the area that is available in this country is really more the millimeter wave part of the spectrum, which has some technical challenges. And fundamentally, where does that leave us if this is all true? Then where does that leave us if our companies and our government and our, all of our commercial activity is focused on a completely different part of the spectrum from non-US companies and governments? Is there a fundamental incompatibility there? And also, sorry to Mr. Kolosky, is it fair to say that we are assuming that scenario and that the US is, the way you were talking about risk mitigation, is it fair to say that we are just assuming a defensive posture, that we are looking at risks and vulnerabilities and trying to mitigate those, but assuming that the US is not going to lead in 5G, or did I overread into your remarks?
Can I answer that one?
You go ahead and answer that, and I'll
just
take
as that was
the
directly,
spectrum.
yes, you overread into my remarks there. I am a security professional, so I start with the risks. But no, I mean, I hope what we're hearing is, what I tried to say is there are opportunities here, and certainly we're trying to be a global leader, not just in security applications and setting up a security regime, but a global leader in other things. It just happens to not be where I spend my time thinking.
So you asked a fantastic question on spectrum, and I'm delighted because not a lot of people in the U.S. have been asking and talking about this. The short answer is yes. We have a major spectrum allocation problem in the United States. It has not been focused on, and where it puts us is behind. And when I say that, what we're thinking about is the evolution to full 5G. You heard me talk at the top about ubiquitous coverage, 10 to 20 gigabit per second speeds, limited latency. To achieve that, you need the full spectrum stack, right? You're going to need lower band spectrum for coverage, which we have. We have allocated 600 and 700 megahertz spectrum to all the operators in the United States. That is in the process of being built out. We have allocated a lot of millimeter wave spectrum, and there is more slated to come at 37 and 39 gigahertz. We need it all because each of those pieces of spectrum do something different in 5G. Now, the question about should we be launching in millimeter wave? Probably not. If we had it to do over again, would we start with allocating mid-band spectrum? I think so. Millimeter wave is useful, but in most of the other countries where Nokia does business, the launch is going to be anchored in mid-band, below 4 gigahertz, primarily in 3.4 to 3.8 gigahertz. Most countries have already allocated it or will be allocating it soon, and they will be allocating it in huge block sizes, 80, 100 megahertz blocks to each of their operators. Those are huge channels through which you can do a lot, and mid-band is kind of the beachfront property because it has both coverage and capacity capability in it. And then millimeter wave would come later as uses scale up and use cases drive the need for more capacity. You can densify deployments using small cells and millimeter wave. That doesn't mean that all of the significant investment that's being made right now in millimeter wave deployments in the United States is a wasted effort. It's important, but it will be squandered to some degree if we do not very quickly make mid-band spectrum available to all of the operators so that we can capitalize on those deployments. And part of the reason is millimeter wave is very difficult to work with. What we're finding, it has very limited propagation characteristics. It has very limited building penetration. Humidity and leaf size can determine whether or not you're getting, 600 meters out of a radio interface or 300. And so those deployments are important, early deployments, but what we're finding is an even smaller part of the urban core can be covered than we thought. So if you want to scale out, if you want to cover more of the United States, you're not going to be covering the bulk of the United States with millimeter wave. Doesn't matter how much of it we make available, it's just not going to be economical. You'll need 10 to 50 times as many radio sites to do it. You're going to have low band, mid band, and millimeter wave spectrum available. And right now we don't. And sadly, we've told the FCC many, many times. It has one band it's been not making a decision on for the better part of a year. It needs to move on the C-band, whatever its choice is. And there's also some shared bands with the U.S. government, 3.1 to 3.55 in particular, that, we've got opposition, from some in the government on. We believe spectrum sharing is a reality. We can figure out how to share and mitigate those concerns. Those are bands that need to be pushed aggressively because we're behind. There's just no way around it.
So if I can paraphrase, sub-6 is really where all the commercial action is.
No, what I would say is it's all important and valuable, and you can't evolve a 5G network for the future in the United States with only one portion of the spectrum that's needed, right? We will get there eventually with all of it, and important work is happening. But, we see a lot of discussion about, the United States is leading, the United States is winning. You can make a case that a number of nations are winning based on what you choose to count. If you're just counting the number of radio nodes on a pole at this point, the U.S. is probably leading. We don't think that's the right metric to determine long-term leadership. It's, do you have the ingredients necessary to lay the foundation for ubiquitous coverage, right? Because if you look at Asia right now, China, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam, all these countries have very large populations, very high population densities that make different land use policy. Build these networks out very quickly and scale them out to billions of people. That has all sorts of implications for U.S. economic security if our companies that lead in web scale and other places aren't going to similarly be able to reach the bulk of the U.S. population for some years to come. It's time to move mid-band into the market. It has been for a while, but it is not fair to say that, we can't do anything because we don't have mid-band. We have to have it all.
Now, just from a DoD kind of perspective.
Tom, I swear I'll move over, but there was a hand over there. I'm going to let Tom talk first, but there's a mic over near you, so please use that mic when it's your turn. So, Tom.
So from a DoD perspective, to the extent that DoD plans to depend on 5G for anything outside the United States, the lower frequencies are going to be more critical because we're not going to be having antennas nicely deployed every 10 feet or whatever it takes for millimeter wave. The longer range that goes with the lower frequencies is going to be critical. And maybe DoD is part of the problem with the spectrum and needs to contribute to it if they care about it.
Okay, it was a question from the other side. You may have to flip it on, the switch. It takes a sec.
Okay. There it is. So this is for Bob. Marian Back from Inside Cybersecurity. You mentioned that you are starting to examine ways to incentivize trusted suppliers. What are you trying to incentivize them to do? Is it to release these quote-unquote vendor locks that you mentioned? Can you talk a little bit more about what you're doing to encourage what I think is Open RAN? Is what you're talking about. And then if you could just clarify, because I thought I heard you say that the Secretary of Commerce might not be the best way to address all supply chain risks. Maybe there were some, you can explain a little bit more.
Sure, that's not a hit on the Secretary of Commerce. I'm simply saying that, and I was particularly talking about the authorities around IEPA and the emergency authorities that were called for in the President's executive order, that is a tool to deal with some critical issues around supply chain risks, but it's a pretty, it's a pretty whatever the word is to describe the tool. It's only one tool of things you can do to manage supply chain risk. And the last thing I think anyone in the policy committee would like to say is just set restrictions to you can't buy from anything for anything in your ICT supply chain. That's not an effective way to do risk management. So that's what I was saying on that one. To your question on examining and thinking about incentives, I think I'm really talking about the interagency discussion about where there are opportunities, as we continue to better understand evolution, what's going to happen, where the market's going, where risks might be, and where there are opportunities to incentivize gaps in where there are places where we don't have trusted suppliers, or we don't have trusted manufacturers, or we don't have trusted manufacturers at scale. That's how we're framing thinking about some of the policy questions of, again, thinking about what's going to happen absent policymaking, and policymaking should only intercede when necessary.
I guess I'm afraid, just to quickly follow up, I'm afraid of misconstruing anything if I say that. Maybe you can just say, what are the gaps? Is it that Mr. Hendricks might take opposition to the idea that Nokia is not filling a certain gap right now? Is that what we're talking about?
I don't have an answer of all the gaps here, and why I'm framing my remarks in some ways in terms of questioning the question we're asking and how we're pulling on that is because I think we want to be smart as an interagency in better understanding how the market's evolving and where there are gaps. I don't think we're ready to say that there's a specific gap, and I think it's similar to some of the reasons Brian's saying, let's continue to learn through this process and not just rush to a solution.
Yeah, I think part of it is understanding the origin of risk. Even in our own conversations with governments around the world, it's unclear what the generation of concerns is. So, for example, if you take a very narrow view that sourcing components in a particular country creates risk, my pushback is not all components can create risk. Power supplies, mounting harnesses, screws, whatever. So let's have a conversation about what causes concern about location of sourcing. Part of that conversation needs to be what are companies actually doing to mitigate concerns about things. What do you do? Do you test? Do you randomly sample when your supplier delivers? What are your on software development? Do you have forensic auditing tools that let you watch what someone's doing through the evolution of code so that at any point you can go back and, with signatures for checking in and checking out and, very understanding what people actually do in the sector and then comparing that with perceived risk and then identifying, okay, some of our concerns have been answered because we just plainly didn't know what companies were doing, but some of these concerns will remain, and what is the best way to address those concerns? To my knowledge, those conversations haven't generally happened globally with policymakers, and so we're still left with country of origin and company-specific concerns. While that may, at the moment, inure to our benefit, it's probably not a practical way to do this on a long-term basis because, when you pick a country and say, I don't like you manufacturing there, at the same time you realize that 95% of the people supplying some kind of ICT infrastructure are sourcing from that country, at least at some level of the supply chain. There's a pragmatic element that is not worked through. So I think we have to start with narrowing, defining what the concerns are, where the risk comes from, what's being done already, which part of that will be highlighting best practices. I mean, maybe some of our practices will be best practices. Maybe there are things we learn from others. But there will be a set of risks left unaddressed, and that can be the basis for discussion. I just don't think we're at that point globally right now.
Okay, so, Paul.
Yep. Can you hear me okay? I'm Paula Trimble. I work with Lewis Burke Associates. We work with universities and research institutes. Much of the discussion so far has been about industry and the industry-government collaboration and policy issues. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you would leverage existing research and development centers and test beds that the government is already putting funding into, such as NSF's wireless test beds, POWER, or the DHS S&T Center for Critical Infrastructure and Resilience, or even DoD's manufacturing institutes. There's one in Chicago that focuses on cybersecurity and supply chain security for the manufacturing sector. And so as you develop those scenarios and look at the risk assessment, how do those research assets that the federal government is funding play into that? And how can you, sort of accelerate experimentation? And you talked about post-development testing.
Sure. So, the R&D component we use most often at DHS is the national laboratories. And so some of what I'm talking about is federally funded research development centers through the national laboratories, which tend to be associated with the Department of Energy. You mentioned CERI, the Center of Excellence at the University of Illinois. The kind of money there is, isn't the kind that's you're going to get a ton of physical type testing or things that are sort of hard science. It's earlier in the thinking about that. One of the things I think we want to do is put out as we have the interagency discussions, nail down some of the research questions we're most interested in answering, publicize those to some extent, but also share where there are centers that could do some of this and try to create more of a unified R&D agenda. We try to do that around a lot of critical infrastructure problems. This is one, and we've had some success here. This is one. As the interagency collaboration increases, I think that's an opportunity to take advantage of things where there has been money and funding. Just because I don't have all the list of places we could take advantage, that doesn't mean that thinking isn't being applied, but I think it's a good idea.
So I think that's a valid point to be made, but I think the problem is lack of focus. We're spreading money across a lot of pet rocks and ideas. We staple them together and call it the federal R&D program, but there isn't actually any concrete objective that is being sought in doing so. I'd point to the Apollo program is a very different kind of example, since it is we're doing this 50th anniversary thing where fantastic amounts of money in the day were spent to get to a specific coherent objective across many different kinds of technologies, components. And it led to making something real. Problem with a lot of these research things is that they sort of identify a theoretical problem, they treat a hypothetical, and it doesn't actually lead to anything happening in our infrastructure. This is in DoD language. This is like 6.1 versus 6.3 stuff, and the expertise that we had a lot more of in this country in the past was when we had the industrial labs. So Bell Labs that Nokia now has it was an example where that was the preeminent place where a lot of R&D was then carried forward, and there was a way that the R&D got carried forward from the very basic research and then went forward. And what we've done instead is we've essentially bifurcated that, where academia's got a lot of the basic, industry's got a lot of the 6.3, and the question is are we a lot? And it connects, but is it connecting in its way as efficiently as it possibly could? And so that would be my approach to that problem.
So you're describing the Valley of Death region, right?
You betcha. And there's another part of this problem which is particularly, so my background is in semiconductor manufacturing. And so what I've observed over the decades is another separate issue, which is that as the manufacturing moves someplace else, the research follows it in the high-tech world, because the ecosystem that's necessary to stay on the cutting edge of research is actually, an academic lab cannot compete with the cutting edge thing that's being done in a big fab, whether it's at Intel or TSMC. Right, so the ecosystem, the supply chain that makes all of that possible follows it, and we're in danger if we go for this design-only kind of mentality that we have in this country, and we don't actually make the stuff. We eventually lose the ecosystem, and eventually we lose the expertise that goes along with all that. It's a bad spiral to be in.
I have to make a quick comment on that myself, because I'm from a similar background, and that's the whole research enterprise is not linear. It doesn't start with 6.1 and progress smoothly through 6.2 and 6.3. There's a lot of feedback that happens, and that's why when you move manufacturing, you move research, because you lose the feedback. You lose the feedback loop. So there's a question from the other side.
Yeah. I go back to the Bellcore Telcordia days. Okay, so I've seen the evolution of telecom. And part of my history is writing the first telecom network element security requirements, GR 815. And I submit that there are network elements being built today that can't meet those requirements. Okay. We're still fighting the battle in terms of tactical default accounts, software loads, et cetera. Okay, so I know we're trying to develop strategy, but we also need to recognize tactical. Okay, and I heard the word architecture mentioned once, which we've over the years have looked at the individual technologies, but how it's all put together into an architecture. Hard problem in terms of securing it, but it needs to be recognized. We also need to recognize legacy. I co-chaired a group on CISRIC to talk about SS7 and diameter, okay, over about a year or so ago when everybody got interested again in SS7, okay. And so we have a legacy problem that we need to be concerned about. I think we also need to be concerned about transition. Because as we're testing devices, UEs that have dual SIMs for 4G, 5G, and how the various Node Bs talk to each other and all that, a lot of security problems right today. Okay, so we can talk about the future of where 5G will be in 5 years, 10 years, whatever. But we have a lot of problems today with suppliers and carriers that are struggling with, how to actually implement the specs. Okay, so I just, so there's a lot of history. I go back to working with BT, British Telecom, 2003 when they embraced Huawei in their 21st century network. So I've seen all the twists and turns with Huawei. I appreciate the comments about how we developed the vendor risk management program way back when and the state of the art in terms of product testing. It's improved somewhat, but still a tough issue. And that's where I think a number of people have made comments about research. Okay, I think research has to be done in a lot of these areas. We don't know all the vulnerabilities in 5G. Nobody does. Okay, we're still working our way through 4G. Okay, and there's been a lot of research done on that and a lot of practice. But anyway, I think, transition, legacy are key areas and a tactical, because otherwise we're going to be here in 5 years and say, why didn't we address all those problems 5 years ago? When we knew about them. Okay, in this whole dual 4G, 5G world that we're in the middle of.
So, that was some good statement. Any comments relative to that, or otherwise I'm happy to move on. Thanks for the input. I remember Belcor, by the way. My first real job was Belcor out of college, so I do remember Belcor. So, okay, question from this side. So is it Rael?
Rael, yeah.
Rael.
So given all of the different stakeholders and players in the market, but especially the new entrants based on new use cases that might come to market, how much of a challenge is information sharing when it comes to security of a 5G network, and then what can be done about it?
Well, we have some recent examples where we have attempted to have the government act as a convening authority to bring information streams together. I speak of like the NIST cyber framework, and there's some lessons learned there, one of which is that industry can tend to be cautious about sharing vulnerability information unless you provide the right environment in which that information can be shared and utilized without there being negative commercial consequences. Something like that is probably essential here. We have some very good threat detection and mitigation capabilities. I mentioned at the top when I was talking about the threat detection reports that Nokia puts out. Part of that is just we have agreements with many of the network operators that we have around the world. We're in 130 some countries where we've deployed millions upon millions of sensors to collect information on threats. And so this gives us a very large data set, a big N to take a look at threats that happen. We share that at the moment, to the best of my knowledge, mostly through our public reports. There's certainly other forums and opportunities for us to share that and even more detailed information. Maybe potentially by bringing in some of these new actors, the use cases, for example, who I mentioned also enterprise. When we think of enterprise, it's not just big business. It's going to be whole new sectors that are using things in new ways, who are going to be empowered in part by the fact that they're not going to have just a relationship with a carrier anymore. There might be opportunities to buy equipment from someone and to go out and manage your own network, private LTE networks and so forth. But they don't have any experience or heritage when it comes to identifying risks or responding to risks and vectors that have been identified by others. And so we probably need to think about new groups or organizations that we can have as threat sharing portals with the government to participate also in sharing information that it is seeing and learning. And so, like I said, I don't think it's perfect for a lot of reasons, but I do think that the cyber framework from NIST is a valuable lesson, and maybe we need something like that again, but more expansive in terms of participation.
So this brings up the whole subject of public-private partnership and how that works. And I would argue that information sharing is step one, and it's usually about where we stop, and usually not as well done as it or as fast as it needs to be. But the problem that is a lot of the partnerships tends to be government with different categories of victims. The partnership needs to be between the government and the people who can actually solve the problem, and that's the carriers in this case. And so what we need is a situation where we are working, the government and the private sector are working together to solve the problem of the day, to actually solve the problem, not to notify each other that 6 months ago you should have done something.
I'll just add, I mean, that's some of what we're trying to get past information sharing, understand the information sharing is a basis for shared understanding and risk mitigation. But, you know, we do have structures in terms of coordinating councils where, you know, there's good information sharing about evolution of risk. We have structures, information sharing analysis centers, particularly the comms IT sector, where there's more real-time information sharing about any threats, vulnerabilities of things that are going on or any activity. I think, you know, as we continue to focus on this as a new area, we'll understand who isn't part of that information sharing environment, and we'll push to make progress in that while making sure that any of the information sharing environments we have right now, you know, we continue to make incremental improvements on that. I think the other aspect of information sharing, we've talked a little bit about international collaboration, the Five Eyes structure, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the UK, and us. This is a principal topic that we're talking about at the Five Eyes construct, where we are sharing information about the government approaches and our understanding of that. You know, that there's a little bit less outside of the Five Eyes construct with some of the other like-minded countries because of some of the protection limitations. So that's something, an area where we probably can make some progress. But certainly it's an area of focus where to share intelligence, to share technical details through that part. The process, and it is important for reason I think all of us have talked about, that this is an international issue and should be treated as such.
But since this is a law firm, I got to throw in a comment about the fact that, you know, the DHS through the NCIC has the carriers, for example, sitting on the floor, as they say, right? The problem is that we don't have protocols in place for this type of event. We need to do this, this, and this. This is the data we're going to share. This is what you're going to be able to do with it on the day. There's a lot of things that we need to have, a lot of work that I know DHS is embarking on, and it's just going to need a lot of support to get through, which is this process of routinizing, handling cyber disasters, just the same way we've routinized handling hurricanes. And we're just not mature enough yet in this area.
Hi, Josh Weaver. I'm a civil servant with the Navy, but I've been supporting the Office of Undersecretary of Defense for Research Engineering, initially with the Spectrum Access Research and Development Program with the National Spectrum Consortium, and most recently with the 5G portfolio that we're getting ready to kick off. It's not quite the $200 billion mark you're looking for, but it's substantial. It's not nothing. It's a pretty healthy investment. So, with that said, I've got two kind of questions, and they're probably both more towards Donahue. We're concentrating primarily on use cases. Now, you mentioned before DoD was supposed to be here, and you did a pretty fair foot stomping of what our position is on, we got a job to do globally, so we need to operate across the spectrum and across the globe, and we got a job to do, and we have to do it no matter what the congestion or congestion is in the spectrum realm. But then it was also mentioned that, with the Apollo program, there was a clear, concise goal on on where we need to go, what needs to be done, and what all this investment should lead to. Do you have recommendations on that with the 5G realm of what that should be? Right now, we're concentrating on the use cases and offering up federal assets and federal areas to test these, improve out these concepts before they roll out into the cities. And then secondly, you mentioned that the inspection regime is impractical for testing the security on this. So if we wanted to sort of red team some of these products and services that we're developing from 6.1, 6.2, all the way to 6.3 into rollout, what is a good way to validate and verify that the stuff that we're building is trusted and assured? Thank you.
So let me do the second one first, because I think the issue of the red teaming is I think you need to red team your trust model, right? Stop trying to be in a situation where you're going to look at every piece of code, every piece of gadget, and what you need to understand is you need to invest at the front end of it all. You need to have people that you trust providing you with products that you understand, and then you need some kind of way of quickly checking that it's doing at least the bare minimum of what you expect. And then to get to Bob's issues, then you need to have a plan for when it betrays you, right? I mean, that's what you do with DoD. As far as I think I think my mantra on this is to say that, infrastructure, we need to build it. Industry, we need to have it. And innovation, we need to invest in it. And so the question is, from DoD's point of view, can you shape industry the way we have done in the past, such that you will get an outcome X number of years down the road that's going to be supportive of you? And figure out who you want to play with and get on with it, right? There are people you can play with today, or you're going to have to go out and make a new one, and which has a lot of issues and problems and challenges to it. But you can also think of it, you need to think of it both at the system level, and you also need to think of it at the component level. Are there critical components, as Brian has alluded to, that you really particularly want to invest in because that's where you think the real issues might be? And if you look at NASA as a model, they had a very peculiar outcome that they were going after that nobody else at the time particularly was interested in. They didn't have Elon Musk then to compete with. And so they had, they figured out where did they need to invest. And that's, I think we need to get back into that mode of thinking and stop being so passive. Commercial off the shelf is great when commercial off the shelf can in fact provide what you have. That policy was not meant to be, and that's all you get. You must live with this. That's not what the policy is. The policy was, look and see if it's available, buy it. If not, then you got to make it. And so we got to start investing in the making. We got to invest in the innovating so there is something to make.
I would add just a quick comment that's this issue that, microelectronics supply chain, another area as an institute we've been involved in, wrestles with the same thing. Can you test your way into security? It's insufficient, right? We agree with that, just like in 5G, it's insufficient. You need more. All right.
And if you look at microelectronics in particular, and the economics that Brian was talking about, but there was the build a fab these days is, I don't know what it is. It's over 10 billion now, right? And it just seems like it keeps the number of fabs in the United States seems to keep declining, right? We talk about U.S. This is a U.S. company and that's U.S. design, but guess what? Almost everybody is going to Taiwan to get it made, or to South Korea. Right? And so we got to think about that whole chain of, and this gets back to Bob's point about risk mitigation. I'm not saying everything needs to be made in the United States. Some things might need to be made in the United States. Some things definitely need to be designed in the United States, but we need to figure out where those risks are and manage those and then invest where we think we actually need to have stuff be right here.
So we're sort of approaching the end of our 2-hour time slot, and I want to make sure that we're respectful of everyone's time. I know we're all busy and have a lot of things going on, but does anyone have sort of a concluding or sort of a strategic final comment, and give a final chance to the audience? So Don, I have a mic here. Just come right up.
I was going to give you the main political. It's not the only event, right? So
Oh yeah, no, right, no, absolutely. As I said before, what we do as an institute is we have several deep dive workshops. This is much too broad of a topic to cover in just this 2 hours today. And what we did, we worked very hard on microelectronic supply chain security and stuff some years ago. We had multiple deep dives where we had people and we had one representations from different parts of the government. We're going to go broad, the economic, financial angle, the Department of Defense angle, a number of other perspectives. We're going to do a number of these things, so stay tuned. You're on our mailing list. We'll definitely follow up with other events because this is a complex issue rife with policy opportunities. So let me actually, before we close up, give the panelists a final chance to make a sort of a concluding remark or a strategic remark. And maybe I'll set the stage with saying, try to make it positive in the sense of what can we do? What can the United States do to put us in a better position for vis-a-vis 5G going forward?
So thank you all for the good discussion, and it's nice to have a panel where I think we all got to say most of everything that was on our mind. I'm sitting here as a U.S. government representative, and there's some inclination to just bang on the table and say this is what we're going to do about 5G, and what I'd like to say from my perspective is I think the fact we're not banging on the table and saying this is what we're going to do about 5G is a good thing and not a bad thing, because we are still in the process of working to better understand the risk, better understand the technology, better understand where the drivers are, and formulate policy that would be smart around these issues. And so please don't hear the hesitancy to give all the answers, just because the answer, this is a complex question, and I think it's in rooms like this and discussions like this that we're going to get smarter and continued collaboration on that, and to better make sure that there's a connection between technology and policy making. So thank you.
I guess I've been sitting here thinking that one point I probably should have emphasized a little bit more is a lot of this is very nuanced, and we need to recognize that blunt instruments often have unpredictable and binary consequences. So I think from a security standpoint, we continue to need to move the conversation away from companies and countries of origin and more towards the origination of risk. Where does it come from? What are you really worried about? How do we meet those concerns? And then I think we also domestically, from a competitive positioning perspective, the question about spectrum made me think a little bit more about this, that being first or at least on the lead lap really does matter. It's consequential, and there's been a lot of marketing puffing going on about we're winning, who's winning, they're winning. Winning is less important than recognizing that covering the U.S. population with the technology and the capability is pretty critical to our national economic future, not just my financial future, but the web scale and the industries, that the U.S. does have a comparative advantage over the rest of the world, and we're lagging at the moment. There are more tools that need to be put in place to assure that the technology isn't limited to urban corridor deployments, which I think there is a real risk will happen unless we step up and meet that. And people really need to think about the consequences to things like a digital divide if the majority of the country doesn't have access to 5G. You can do a lot with LTE, but there's a lot you can't do. And it's going to have a real limitation as we move to a digitalized economy if large pockets of your population don't have it. But it also does put companies where the U.S. does have a strong advantage at the moment at real risk. And so domestically, we need to step up our game.
Thank you. Tom.
We need to invest in this industry. Telecommunications is the nervous system of this nation, of this economy, of our defensive capabilities. In the past, we've used things like a moonshot to drive industry, which then led to broader benefits. There's a similar model to be held here, which is that this industry, the telecommunications industry, is essentially like the anchor of a department store in a big mall, and we need to have that anchor in order to be able to allow the rest of it to grow and to have that ecosystem in which innovation can occur in high technology, such that we will continue to lead and prosper as a global power.
Fantastic. So please join me in giving a hand to our terrific panel here. Thank you. And thanks to Venable for collaborating with us on this and providing this wonderful, wonderful venue here. It's really, really great. And stay tuned, because if you're interested in this topic, we're going to do a number of follow-up events covering different aspects of the 5G issue. So thank you, everybody, for coming. And